Ladies and gentlemen, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session of Zed Conference and to a talk which attempts to cover the huge range of things that will disrupt everything we know in the years ahead. Our speaker, Gordon, is one of EPAM's lead business analyst, a product engineer, and agile trainer. He describes himself as a geek at heart because we will hear that science and technology has always been a major interest for him. In recent times, he has taken a particular interest in what's needed to transition humanity to sustainable, renewable, and equitable future and massive changes which are brought to affect every area of life. Whatever your background, I can pretty much guarantee there will be something in the next half an hour which will blow your mind. So settle in, buckle up, and enjoy the ride. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you. In the next 10 to 15 years, we will have choices and possibilities beyond anything that has gone before. We could eradicate poverty, make wars over scarce resources unnecessary, stop and even reverse climate change, and perhaps for the first time, achieve real freedom. In the words of Tony Zaber and Jamie Arbib, we are on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of human civilization in history. A transformation every bit as significant as the move from foraging to cities and agricultures 10,000 years ago. But this future is by no means guaranteed. We, all of us, must choose the direction that we wish to take. I'm going to take you through the possibilities, the good and the bad, to help you understand the paths and the choices that lie ahead. But before we talk about the drama to come, I want to take you back to the past. I wasn't always the handsome individual that stands in front of you today. Back in the 1970s and early 80s, my mum, and yes, that is me in the photo, used to take me here. But why? Because I'd fallen in love with this man, Isaac Asimov, and I couldn't get enough of him. From his Foundation series and the predictions of Harry Seldon through iRobot and more, I devoured everything that I could find, moving on to discover Robert A. Heinlein and others. Raised on a steady diet of Star Trek and Tomorrow's World, I fell in love with the visions that they painted of the future. And then, in 2015, I came across a little website called Wait But Why by Tim Urban. And on that site, I found a question and a picture that really got me thinking. And the question was this: what does it feel like to stand here? To quote Tim, it seems like a pretty intense place to be standing. But then you have to remember something about standing on a time graph, and that's that you can't see what's to your right. So here's what it actually feels like to stand there, which probably feels pretty normal, right? As Tim goes on to say, imagine taking a time machine back to 1750, a time when the world was in a permanent power outage. Long-distance communication meant either yelling loudly or firing a cannon in the air, and all transportation ran on hay. And when you get there, you retrieve a dude, bring him to 2015, and then walk him around and show him everything. It would be like inconceivable sorcery. The experience for him wouldn't just be shocking or surprising or even mind-blowing. Those words aren't big enough. He might actually die. But here's the interesting thing. If he took your time machine and went back the same distance and grabbed somebody from around the year, let's say 1500, brought him to 1750 and showed him everything, sure, the 1500 guy would be shocked by a lot of things, but he wouldn't die. it would be far less of an insane experience for him, because while 1500 and 1750 were very different, they were much less different than 1750 to 2015. For the 1750 guy to have as much fun as we'd had with him, he'd have to go much further back, maybe back all the way to 12,000 BC, before the first agricultural revolution, leading to the first cities and the concept of civilization. And for that 12,000 BC guy to have as much fun, he'd have to go even further back, maybe 100,000 years, and get someone he could show fire and language to for the very first time. This pattern, human progress moving quicker and quicker as time goes on, is what futurist Ray Kurzweil calls human history's law of accelerating returns. Kurzweil believes that the 21st century will see 1,000 times the progress of the 20th century. If Kurzweil and others who agree with him are correct, then we may be as blown away by 2030 as our 1750 guy was by 2015. And the world in 2050 might be so vastly different to today's world that we would barely recognize it. So why do we struggle wrapping our heads around this? A few reasons. Firstly, we think in straight lines. The next slide shows how what a lot of people think will happen in their future based on their recent experience. But this is what actually happens when growth is exponential. You get surprised. When we imagine the progress of the next 30 years, we tend to look back to the progress of the previous 30 as an indicator of how much will likely happen, the red line. If you're being a little bit more clever about it, you might predict the progress of the next 30 years by taking the current rate of progress and judging based on that, the orange line. You'd be more accurate, but still way off. What you're actually facing is the green line, and it's only getting steeper. Here's a simple thought experiment to demonstrate the difference. If your stride is 1 meter, 30 linear steps will take you 30 meters from your starting point. But if you double the length of your stride with each step, 30 exponential steps will take you 26 trips around the world, over 1 million kilometers. Now, of course, exponential trends don't last forever, but some trends can continue for long periods, driven by successive technological paradigms, which are made up of a series of consecutive S-shaped technological life cycles, or S-curves. So, before we get into what lies ahead in the next 10 to 15 years, let's have a look at some historical S-curves, starting with the introduction of the automobile. Initially, people laughed off the adoption of the motor car. "I do not believe the introduction of motor cars will ever affect the riding of horses." Mr. Scott Montague, UK MP, 1903. Nice to see MPs as in touch with reality as usual. So how fast was the automobile adopted? Adoption in the US went from 2.5% to nearly 95% between 1905 and 1925. But most of that adoption took place over a 10-year period between 1910 and 1920, taking market penetration from 11% to 81%. And don't forget, at the start of this period, there were almost no paved roads. And if you needed petrol or gasoline, somebody had to bring it to you in a horse-drawn cart. Oh, and we got World War I in the middle of all of this. So let's take a more recent example, the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, just 13 years ago. Adoption in the US went from 3% at the end of 2007 to 81% just 9 years later. And in 2020, nearly half the world has a smartphone. So what was the reaction when the iPhone was introduced in 2007? There's no chance the iPhone's going to get any significant market share. No chance, said Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, in April of that year. So here's one example of just how deceptive exponential growth can be. And this is looking at the progress until computers have the same computing power as the human brain. And on the next slide, I want you to watch the date in the corner, and the filling up of the lake is the increase in computing power. So just watch. Seemingly nothing happens right until the end. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, yeah, so what? I know this already. And yes, working in the IT industry, we all know, or at least think we know, about the growth in smartphones, computing power, etc. But if you consider the ripple effects of the introduction of the smartphone, you start to glimpse the implications for our future. The way that we found jobs, worked, shopped, and entertained ourselves changed radically, almost overnight. The arrival of social media had an even greater transformative effect, completely upending traditional channels not just of communication, but also of information, where individuals could, for the first time, create their own content and share it with billions of people at the touch of a button. Dating was completely transformed. The percentage of heterosexual couples who met online went from 2% in 1995 to almost 40% in 2017. And there were other unexpected consequences. Uber was founded in 2009 from an apartment in San Francisco. Just 7 years later, they had more bookings than the entire taxi industry in America. But ride-hailing is just one dimension in how smartphones have disrupted transportation. The improvement in lithium-ion battery costs, driven initially by the consumer electronics market and then by the smartphone, means that electric vehicles are now disrupting the high end of the gasoline vehicle market and are about to disrupt the mainstream, and in fact already are. And at the same time, incredible strides are being made in developing autonomous vehicles. Tesla's full self-driving is improving rapidly, and in my personal opinion, by the end of 2021, autonomy looks like it may be essentially a solved problem. The convergence of ride-hailing, autonomy, and EVs will also give rise to an entirely new form of transport, known as transportation as a service, and we heard this from Chris and Tarek in their How Saab Disrupted Tesla talk earlier in the week. And this is where we start to understand how the world may look very different in 2030. Robo-taxis will be dramatically cheaper than car ownership, costing as little as 10 times less per mile and saving the average American family more than $5,600 a year. But to get to the level of disruption I mentioned at the start, we need more than self-driving cars. Transport is just one of the 5 foundational sectors being disrupted, and they are information, energy, transport, food, and materials. Ask yourself this: what if the exponential growth I've been talking about started to apply to everything? What if everything becomes fundamentally a software problem? Let's start with information and a reminder of just how far we've come. The cost of storage per megabyte and adjusted for inflation dropped from around just over $84,000 in 1956 to just 1.5 thousandths of a cent in 2020. For processing power, let's look at games consoles. The PS2, launched in March 2000, could do 6.2 million calculations per second. The PS5, launched just recently, can do 10.28 trillion. And just for comparison, to put that into context, the human brain is only around 100 teraflops, likely available for a few $100s in 2027. And what about AI? In 2015, many commentators thought that a computer that could beat the best humans at Go were many years, if not decades away, until AlphaGo beat European champion Fang Hui in October of that year. A few months later, it beat the world champion Lee Sedol 4 games to 1. And a year after that, AlphaGo Zero beat the previous version of AlphaGo 100 games to 0, but without any human games to learn from. It was simply given the rules of the game and allowed to practice against itself. Now, DeepMind's StarCraft 2 AI is better than 99.8% of all human players. And of course, the computers and humans need to be able to talk to each other. Starlink satellites are rapidly blanketing the world with internet access, opening up the opportunity for millions, if not billions, more people to join the global economy. And that high-speed, low-latency connection changes what working from home will mean. We often still think of remote work as something we do with laptops, but soon you'll be able to do anything from anywhere, and this is remote control construction from Caterpillar. The impact of this on immigration, border controls, taxes, labour regulations, even the concepts of nationalism, the existence of nation states are extraordinary. And what will power all of this technology? According to RethinkX, solar, wind, and batteries. The cost of solar has collapsed dramatically, and this prediction is already out of date. Look at what Tesla are charging now. £1.49 or $1.49 per watt. And this picture shows how fast we're actually adding new solar power generation compared to what was predicted. And to understand how disruptive this is, listen to this. The cost of renewables has fallen so far that it is already cheaper to build new renewable energy capacity, including battery storage, than to continue operating 39% of the world's existing coal capacity, increasing rapidly to 60% in 2022 and 73% in 2025, which looks like this. RethinkX have calculated that the least expensive 100% renewable system has 3 to 5 times the generation capacity of what we have right now, but only needs 35 to 90 hours worth of batteries. With the cost to install it falling another 70% by 2030 and near zero marginal cost of production, you don't have to pay for the fuel, disruption is inevitable. New investment in coal, gas, or nuclear is financially unviable, and existing assets will be stranded. And it's not just how power is generated, but where and by whom. Autonomous energy grids and local generation and storage will turn the existing distribution model on its head, moving from a one-way broadcast to a multi-directional energy network. And we've talked about cars and the dramatically lower cost of transportation as a service, but that's not all. We'll see autonomous drone deliveries by air and by land, dramatically reducing costs per parcel and further boosting e-commerce. Autonomous air taxis, rocket-powered intraplanetary travel, and perhaps even the first steps towards people settling on Mars. But let's come back down to Earth and talk about my and many people's favourite subject, food. Raising livestock for meat, eggs, and milk generates 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the second biggest source of emissions overall and greater than all transportation combined. It uses about 70% of agricultural land and is one of the leading sources of deforestation, biodiversity loss, and water pollution. So what's the answer? Precision fermentation. The ability to program microorganisms to produce almost any complex organic molecule. And this isn't new. It's been used to produce rennet, which is used in cheese production for years, and that used to come from the stomachs of veal calves. And that's not the only thing that used to come from animals. Insulin used to come from the pancreases of cows and pigs, and it took a staggering 50,000 animals to produce just 1 kilo of insulin. Back in 1978, Genentech created a genetically modified yeast to produce humulin, human insulin. It was approved by the FDA in 1982, and by the year 2000, animal insulin was less than 1% of the market. And more recently, the Impossible Whopper, which you can buy in Burger King in the States. And heme, the substance that gives it the meaty flavor and makes it bleed, is created from soy using precision fermentation. But the disruption will come from the rapidly declining cost of producing proteins this way. In the year 2000, it cost $1 million per kilogram. By last year, 2019, that was down to $100 per kilogram. By 2025, that will drop to $10 a kilo, which is cost competitive with mass market and bulk foods. By 2030, it will be 5 times cheaper, and by 2035, it will be 10 times cheaper. Eventually, it approaches the marginal cost of sugar plus water and the near zero marginal cost energy sourced from renewables. So what does this mean for the likes of beef and dairy? Ground beef market down 70%. Steak market down 30%. The dairy market down a staggering 90%. Precision fermentation only needs to disrupt about 3.3% of milk's overall volume, the key functional proteins, to completely collapse the cow milk industry. And if you think this is fanciful, you can already buy animal-free, lactose-free and vegan-friendly ice cream made from whey protein produced using this technique. It's a company called Perfect Day. And this will have a dramatic impact on land use. In the US, 325 million acres will be freed up by 2030 and up to 485 million acres by 2035. Now, if you can't visualize that, and I was struggling a bit, it's 13 times the size of Iowa, or for Europeans like me, 6 times the size of Germany. And excluding the land needed for modern production, 620 million acres will be freed up by 2035 through adopting these techniques. And the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions will be huge. RethinkX estimate that direct emissions from all animal agriculture combined will fall by 55% by 2030 and on course to 75% by 2035. Now, if you use that freed land for reforestation, actively reforesting just 10% of that 485 million acres would make what remains of the animal agriculture sector carbon neutral by 2035. And those precision fermentation techniques can be used to produce materials as well. In 2015, North Face collaborated with a firm called Spiber to create a parka jacket made from modified spider silk. When you can engineer microbes to produce any molecule that you can think of, material design becomes yet another software problem. And what about 3D printing? It's not just for small things anymore. Icon has developed a method for printing a single-story house, 650 square feet, out of cement in only 12 to 24 hours, and this is that house. The prototype was only $10,000, and they plan to bring that down to just $4,000 per house. So what does all this mean when you put it together? It means we're moving from breaking things down to extract the useful bits to constructing what we need from the atoms up. We're moving from extraction to creation. And it's all of these things combining that allow what I said at the very start of this, the ability to eradicate poverty. Universal basic income has been seen as a necessary but often unaffordable way to help support us through the disruptions to employment that are coming and that we've already seen more than just a hint of with the pandemic. But what if everything you needed was affordable? What if everything everybody needed was affordable? And by everything, I mean 1,000 miles a month of transport, 2,000 kilowatt hours per month of energy, complete nutrition, 100 clean litres of water per day, continuing education, 500 square feet of living space, and all your communications. This could be provided to every human being on Earth for less than $250 a month by 2030, and half that by 2035. At that price, a dignified life could be a basic, affordable human right for everyone. Freedom from economic want, from the fear of survival, becomes more than just a possibility, it becomes a choice. But of course, this level of change will disrupt everything that we've known, and historically, that hasn't turned out so well. From the dawn of the extraction age, we've seen civilizations advance or decline in a series of phase changes, and looking back, a recurring pattern is clear to see. Large jumps in societal capability, followed by a new equilibrium, followed by a collapse into a dark age. Each step up represents approximately a 10 times jump in settlement size and capability relative to the previous high. Our current organizing system, based on centralized extraction, is going to be forced to change as we move towards decentralized production and abundance. In the face of collapse rather than adapt, civilizations have tended to redouble their efforts on what had worked previously. More extraction, more walls, more blood sacrifices, or simply more power for the central authority, be those kings, emperors, or the elites that endorse them. And indeed, many of our current governments are dinosaurs. democracies in name only. There are many vested interests who will continue to desperately try and maintain the status quo. But this time, with the global interconnectedness, knowledge sharing, and the mobility of people and of information, we have the opportunity to plan for a better future. And to help you visualize what's going on, take a look at this. Currently, we've been progressing along this line. Car manufacturers still planning to launch new combustion engine vehicles. Investments in rail infrastructure, which likely will never see the level of use it needs, HS2 in the UK. Trump rolling back environmental protections and trying to bring back coal jobs. But the step changes in technology are already happening, and we're hitting the rupture point. Beyond here, things were becoming increasingly unsettled as wave after wave of disruption hits society. And to avoid us dropping into the abyss of another dark age, we need to prepare and adapt so we can surf those waves instead and emerge into an age of freedom. So how do we do that? With so much change across so many sectors, how can we possibly make the right decisions? Firstly, we need to recognize there is no going back. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle. We need to be prepared for regular shocks throughout the 2020s. Financial crises, pandemics, social unrest, state failure, environmental catastrophes, and mass migration. We need to think about the cascading impacts of sector disruptions and how they combine to magnify the effects. We need to devolve power to cities, regions, and states to decentralize decision-making, that whole team of teams model we've been talking about. We should aim for robust and resilient systems, local self-sufficiency rather than, as the pandemic has showed, vulnerable just-in-time global supply chains. It'll be vital to remove barriers to the new system, including unnecessary red tape, regulations, and laws. All subsidies, direct and indirect, to legacy sectors should be stopped, and regulations used to support the new system, like the ban on the installation of gas boilers in new build UK houses from 2025. We must give individuals control and ownership of data rights and create rules to ensure open access to data and interfaces that are in the public interest, like traffic flows in a city. But these seem like mostly governmental matters for now. How do you make the right decisions for you and your business? These heuristics might help. The building blocks of the new production system will be the bit and later qubit, photon, electron, molecule, and DNA. These building blocks are available and plentiful everywhere and can be recombined in infinite ways to create new products and services at essentially zero cost. Building blocks that are more powerful, lighter, and faster are superior to those that are less or similarly powerful, slower, and heavier. And to help you understand that, here's some examples. Electric vehicles powered by electrons disrupt ICE vehicles powered by atoms. Solar, photons, disrupts fossil fuels, atoms. And battery storage disrupts centralized fossil fuels. High-definition mapping and localization infrastructure will make existing roads dramatically more efficient, so there may be no need to build new roads. Autonomous vehicles will drive much of the day, so 90% of parking will be redundant. Bits beats atoms. Designing molecules using food as software and producing them via lighter, faster, local precision fermentation infrastructure using microorganisms beats macroorganisms such as cows and pigs that need vast amounts of land, fossil fertilizer, and factory farming. So as we stand at this crossroads, which path will we take as individuals, as a business, and as a species? I may not have the foresight of Isaac Asimov's Harry Seldon or the predictive power of his psychohistory, but to quote my favorite entrepreneur, Elon Musk, you should take the approach that you're wrong. Your goal is to be less wrong. My hope and desire is that this talk helps all of us to be less wrong about the disruptive decade ahead. Thank you.